the 1969 postmodern historical fiction novel by John Fowles. The plot explores the fraught relationship of gentleman and amateur naturalist Charles Smithson and Sarah Woodruff, the former governess and independent woman with whom he falls in love. The novel builds on Fowles' authority in Victorian literature, both following and critiquing many of the conventions of period novels. Postmodern literature is a form of literature that is characterized by the use of metafiction, unreliable narration, self-reflexivity, intertextuality, and which often thematizes both historical and political issues. This style of experimental literature emerged strongly in the United States in the 1960s through the writings of authors such as Kurt Vonnegut, Thomas Pynchon, William Gaddis, Philip K. Dick, Kathy Acker, and John Barth. Postmodernists often challenge authorities, which has been seen as a symptom of the fact that this style of literature first emerged in the context of political tendencies in the 1960s. 1. This inspiration is, among other things, seen through how postmodern literature is highly self-reflexive about the political issues it speaks to. Historical fiction is a literary genre in which the plot takes place in a setting related to the past events, but is fictional. Although the term is commonly used as a synonym for historical fiction literature, it can also be applied to other types of narrative, including theater, opera, cinema, and television, as well as video games and graphic novels. An essential element of historical fiction is that it is set in the past and pays attention to the manners, social conditions and other details of the depicted period. Authors also frequently choose to explore notable historical figures in these settings, allowing readers to better understand how these individuals might have responded to their environments. The historical romance usually seeks to romanticize eras of the past. Some subgenres such as alternate history and historical fantasy insert intentionally ahistorical or speculative elements into a novel. John Robert Fowles Fowles, the 31st of March 1926, the 5th of November 2005, was an English novelist of international renown, critically positioned between modernism and postmodernism. His work was influenced by Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, among others. The book was the author's third, after The Collector 1963 and The Magus 1965. American Libraries magazine counted the novel among the notable books of 1969. 3. Subsequent to its initial popularity, publishers produced numerous editions and translated the novel into many languages. Soon after the initial publication, the novel was also treated extensively by scholars. The novel remains popular, figuring in both public and academic conversations. In 2005, Time chose the book as one of the 100 best English-language novels since the magazine began publication in 1923. Part of the novel's reputation concerns its postmodern literary qualities, with expressions of metafiction, historiography, metahistory, Marxist criticism, and feminism. Stylistically and thematically, the novel has been described as historiographic metafiction. The contrast between the independent Sarah Woodruff and the more stereotypical male characters often earns the novel attention for its treatment of gender issues. The novel was adapted into a film of the same name in 1981, with script by the playwright Harold Pinter, directed by Carol Rice, starring Meryl Streep and Jeremy Irons. The film received considerable critical acclaim, including several BAFTA and Golden Globe awards. Summary. Set in the mid-19th century, the narrator identifies the novel's protagonist as Sarah Woodruff, the woman of the title, also known as tragedy, and as the French lieutenant's whore. She lives in the coastal town of Lyme Regis as a disgraced woman, supposedly abandoned by a French ship's officer named Vargens who had returned to France and married. Employed as a servant in the household of the very pious Mrs. Pulteney, she spends some of her limited free time on the Cobb, a stone jetty where she stares out to sea. One day, Charles Smithson, an orphaned gentleman, and Ernestina Freeman, his fiancée and a daughter of a wealthy tradesman, see Sarah walking along the cliffside. Ernestina tells Charles something of Sarah's story, and he becomes curious about her. Though continuing to court Ernestina, Charles has several more encounters with Sarah, meeting her clandestinely 3 times. During these meetings, Sarah tells Charles of her history, and asks for his emotional and social support. During the same period, he learns of the possible loss of his place as heir to his elderly uncle, who has become engaged to a woman young enough to bear a child. Meanwhile, Charles's servant Sam falls in love with Mary, the maid of Ernestina's aunt. In fact, Charles has fallen in love with Sarah and advises her to leave Lyme for Exeter. Returning from a journey to warn Ernestina's father about his uncertain inheritance, Charles stops in Exeter as if to visit Sarah. From there, the narrator, who intervenes throughout the novel and later becomes a character in it, offers 3 different ways in which the novel could end. First ending. Charles does not visit Sarah, but immediately returns to Lyme to reaffirm his love for Ernestina. They marry, though the marriage never becomes particularly happy, and Charles enters trade under Ernestina's father, Mr. Freeman. The narrator pointedly notes the lack of knowledge about Sarah's fate. Charles tells Ernestina about an encounter which he implies is with the French lieutenant's whore, but elides the sordid details, and the matter is ended. The narrator dismisses this ending as a daydream by Charles, before the alternative events of the subsequent meeting with Ernestina are described. Critic Michelle Phillips Buchberger describes this first ending as a semblance of verisimilitude in the traditional, happy ending, found in actual Victorian novels. Before the second and third endings, the narrator appears as a character sharing a railway compartment with Charles. He tosses a coin to determine the order in which he will portray the other 2 possible endings, emphasizing their equal plausibility. They are as follows. Second ending. Charles and Sarah have a rash sexual encounter in which Charles realizes that Sarah was a virgin. Reflecting on his emotions during this, Charles ends his engagement to Ernestina, and proposes to Sarah through a letter. Charles's servant Sam fails to deliver the letter and, after Charles breaks his engagement, Ernestina's father disgraces him. His uncle marries and his wife bears an heir, ensuring the loss of the expected inheritance. To escape the social suicide and depression caused by his broken engagement, Charles goes abroad to Europe and America. Ignorant of Charles's proposal, Sarah flees to London without telling her lover. During Charles's trips abroad, his lawyer searches for Sarah, finding her 2 years later living in the Chelsea house of the painter and poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti, where she enjoys an artistic, creative life. Sarah shows Charles the child of their affair, leaving him in hope that the 3 may be reunited. Third ending. The narrator reappears outside the house at 16 Cheyne Walk and turns back his pocket watch by 15 minutes. Events are the same as in the second ending version until Charles meets Sarah, when their reunion is sour. The new ending does not make clear the parentage of the child and Sarah expresses no interest in reviving the relationship. Charles leaves the house, intending to return to the United States, wondering whether Sarah is a manipulative, lying woman who exploited him. The narrator. As in other works of metafiction, the narrator's voice frequently intervenes in the story with a personality of its own. Though the voice appears to be that of Fowles, Magali Cornier Michael notes that Chapter 13, which discusses the role of author and narrator within fiction, distinguishes between the author's role in the text and the narrator's. Alice Farab describes the narrator as both a lens for critiquing traditional gender roles and a perpetuation of the perspectives on gendered identity perpetuated by the male gaze. Sarah Woodruff, the main protagonist. According to the narrator, formerly a governess, she becomes disgraced after an illicit, but unconsummated, liaison with an injured French naval lieutenant, who washed ashore. The feminist critic Magali Cornier Michael argues that she is more a plot device, not interpretable as a main character because her thoughts and motivations are only interpreted from the perspective of outside male characters. Sarah offers a representation of myth or symbol within a male perspective on women. Charles Smithson, the main male character. Though born into a family with close ties to nobility, Smithson does not possess a title but has a sizable income and considerable education. Early in the novel he is described both as a casual naturalist and a Darwinist. Though trying to become an enlightened and forward-thinking individual, the narrator often emphasizes, through commentary on Smithson's actions and situation, that his identity is strongly rooted in the traditional social system. Moreover, conflicting identification with social forces, such as science and religion, led Smithson to an existential crisis. Ernestina Freeman, Smithson's fiancée and daughter to a London-based owner of department stores. Unlike Sarah, Ernestina's temperament is much less complex, and much more simple-minded. Sam Farrow, Charles's hackney servant with aspirations to become a haberdasher. Throughout the novel, Sam becomes the narrator's model for the working-class peoples of Victorian Britain, comparing Sam's identity with Charles's ignorance of that culture. According to critic David Landrum, the tension between Sam and Charles Smithson importantly demonstrates Marxist class struggle, though this aspect of the novel is often overlooked by criticism emphasizing Charles's relationship to Sarah. 17. Dr. Grogan, an Irish doctor in the town of Lyme Regis who both advises the various upper-class families in the town, and becomes an advisor to Charles. His education and interest in Darwin and other education make him a good companion for Charles. Mr. Freeman, the father of Ernestina, he earned his wealth as an owner of a drapery and clothes sales chain of stores. He represents the rising entrepreneurial class in England, which stands in stark contrast to the old money which Smithson comes from. Mrs. Tranter, a prominent member of Lyme Regis society who is friends with Grogan and, as her maternal aunt, hosts Ernestina during her stay. Mrs. Pulteney, a wealthy widow and, at the beginning of the novel, the employer of Sarah Woodruff. Hypocritical and hypersensitive, her character fulfills the archetype of high society villainess. Mary, stereotypical lower-class servant to Mrs. Tranter and future wife to Sam Farrow. Montague, Charles Smithson's family lawyer of a firm which has been around since the 18th century. 2 to 3 years older than Charles, he helps his client in search of Sarah towards the end of the novel.